Good morning and welcome to our seminar this morning, our webinar on good governance in charities. I'm Sudhir Singh. I'm head of the not-for-profit team at MHA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar. We have an exciting hour or so of presentations ahead of us, and then some Q&A time after that. I'm going to start by sharing my screen to do some welcomes. So hopefully you can now see a screen. So we're going to be providing you with some updates and some guidance on good governance in the charity sector. As I said, there will be time for some questions at the end. Please do use the Q&A button that you should have at the bottom of your screens to raise your questions. Feel free to do that throughout the presentations, and at the end I will chair the question session and ask your questions for you. Unfortunately, with so many people involved, we can't have you all asking your questions, but I will make sure we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. If we don't get through everything, we'll make sure we have a record of them, and we'll try and get back to you and answer them offline if necessary. This webinar is being recorded, I'm pleased to say, so it will be available to you on demand later this week, and for anyone else who you'd like to forward it to or highlight it to you in your communities. Just as an introduction to ourselves, we have three speakers today. Nicola Mason, who is in our not-for-profit team up in the northwest of the country, and then James Gare and Fiona Westwood, who are in our not-for-profit team in the West Country. We are very much a national not-for-profit team. We act for a significant number of charities, something over 1,200, making us one of the largest firms working in the not-for-profit sector. Our presenters are all highly experienced in working in the charity sector. I think we've worked out that between us we have well over 100 years of experience working with charity clients. I think all of us are auditors, so we have a lot of experience of charity governance. Not only that, but all of us are volunteer. We're also trustees, so we do see governance from both sides of the fence. And that really illustrates why we have a long-term commitment to seeking to develop charity governance. And I'm going to highlight later on at the end of the webinar all the resources that we have available for the charity sector. And these are put on our MHA Trustee Hub, which is a resource portal that provides lots of resources for good governance. But more of that later. So I'm going to hand on now to Nicola to start. She's going to cover effective financial governance and the revision to the Charity Governance Code. Then she's going to hand on to James, who's going to talk a bit about practical adoption of good governance in your charities. And then finally, Fiona is going to conclude by taking a trustee's view on how good governance should be undertaken. And then, as I said, we'll have some questions after that. So I hope you'll enjoy this webinar, and I'm going to hand on now to Nicola to start. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you, Sudhir. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Oops, that's the wrong one. I'll just do that. Okay. I'll just try that again. Okay.
That's fine.
That's fine. Okay, I'll start from there. Okay, so making a start. Oh, you've lost me as well. Okay, so in terms of overall strategy, so charities responded very quickly when the pandemic first hit, as in many cases the services were still needed and demand often increased for those services. With things now changing again as the country opens back up, now's a very good opportunity to reflect on what has been achieved and what the charity wants to do next. So starting with strategy, I suppose that's the first element in looking at what the charity wants to do going forward. James will be looking at strategy again, but essentially there are three elements. Consideration of where the charity is now, where it wants to be, and how it's going to get there. So ensuring the financial feasibility of those plans will ensure that strategy is achievable. So in looking at what we want to do next, the first financial element there is the reserves policy. So this gives the trustees the opportunity of thinking about what level of reserves they want to keep and retain within the charity. If it's set too low, the charity might not be able to manage unexpected changes in income or expenditure or contingencies. If it's set too high, this may impact on fundraising possibilities and opportunities. This is quite often reviewed and established as a particular number of months of expenditure, but there are a number of other considerations that the trustees may want to include, particularly if they're looking at doing different things within the charity and taking advantage of some of the things they've done differently during the pandemic. So they might want reserves for initial development of new services before grant funding can be obtained. Again, if you are looking at new sources of income, that grant funding might be claimed at the end of a period. So you effectively, the charity needs to fund those services initially. The cost base of the charity may have changed over the last 18 months, and in terms of the different ways in which services are provided. And again, there may be future capital costs or infrastructure resulting from that future strategy. So all again, those considerations need to be included in developing that reserves policy and deciding what level of funds the charity wants to keep. That will then allow the trustees to monitor against that. Oh, there we go, sorry. Oh, there you go. That will allow trustees to monitor the level of reserves they're holding against that. I suppose just a reminder that we are talking about what's termed free reserves. So this is the level of unrestricted funds that the trustees can use for their purposes, rather than hold the restricted maybe project funding that's ring-fenced for particular purposes. So once we've set that reserves policy, the trustees have then got a clear view of what that means in terms of what they want to keep. They can then look at setting budgets based on the strategy that they want to follow. Obviously, in an ideal world, charities would be able to do all the things they wanted to do. But obviously there's financial constraints around that. So it's important to budget for what the plans are and how that fits in with kind of other kind of fundraising and other opportunities as well, just to make that sure that's sustainable going forward. Again, as part of that budgeting process, the board will need to consider who needs to be involved in that process, because there are kind of various, I suppose, individuals within the organisation who it would be useful to involve in that process. And the board needs to make sure also that it understands the assumptions being used in that budgeting process, so that they're kind of satisfied that they are realistic and are reflecting a true picture. Again, it's useful looking at those budgets in the short and medium term, so they can see what that means sort of 2-3 years down the line. And again, it is also useful to look at various scenarios to see what the impact would be if different things occurred. Okay, and then as part of the budgeting process, it's important to look at cash flows as well, to incorporate things like repayment of loans, any kind of bounce back loans, and also any kind of time to pay agreements as well. And again, that then once that budget has been set, it can be monitored in line with forecasts going forward. Okay, in terms of systems and controls, the annual return requires that trustees have reviewed that on an annual basis, their controls and procedures, but trustees may not have evidenced that or consider that going forward. Given the rapid switch to home working, it's possible that development of systems and controls lagged behind. We've also kind of lost the opportunity to kind of ask colleagues if things look right, and potentially with people working on their own, that there's more risk of people doing things that they wouldn't normally do. With more volunteers being recruited or different volunteers going forward, and also the threat of more fraud constantly, it's now more important than ever that systems and controls are reviewed regularly and implemented. So the adherence to systems and controls should be embedded within the culture, and meaning that staff at all levels should be complying with them. When I started in practice, I'd often ask trustees what the controls were about expenditure, and they would say they need 2 signatories for all expenditure. You'd then get hold of the checkbook, and there'd be a whole raft of cheques signed by one of the trustees, all blank cheques, because they couldn't get on regularly. But to them, again, that control was working. I don't see that anymore. But again, that's just an example of, I suppose, people kind of working around systems and procedures. So we need to kind of, I suppose, embed in the culture that they are important, and that all levels need to comply with them. So again, in order to ensure that systems and controls are complied with, you need to make sure that they are effectively documented and available for all staff. It's kind of no good having the procedures in a file in the finance office. They need to be evident within and throughout the organisation. And they should be signposted to volunteers and staff when they start in induction, and also I suppose kind of a regular update in terms of how those have been updated going forward. When charities are having internal or external audits, those reviews generally generate recommendations for improvements to systems, and it's important that those recommendations are converted into actions with clear responsibilities of who's going to take that forward, and any I suppose a time scale as well in terms of when those are going to be resolved. I think it should form part of trustee reporting, how those recommendations have been actioned and what's gone on to resolve them. In terms of new activities as well, again, the kind of board and the senior leaders just need to consider how those impact on systems and procedures and what needs to be put in place to kind of make sure that they are controlled effectively. And again, there's lots more developments in software that will assist in improving controls and procedures, things like, I suppose, more effective accounting systems, electronic signatories, and those kinds of things. So I think it's important to consider if there are ways of making things easier going forward. So just in terms of management reporting, I suppose once the trustees have set their strategy, their budgets, it's then important they are able to monitor the financial position of the charity. So and again, it allows comparison of the performance against the set budget, so we can identify any issues as early as possible and put things in place to resolve them. So in terms of the production of management accounts, there should be a clear timescale to make sure that management accounts are received on a timely basis. So that, so again, that decisions can be made as soon as possible if any issues are identified. In looking at the format of the accounts, again, different people will need different levels of information. So it's worth considering what the trustees would like and what senior leaders and also budget holders need to see as well. It may be that trustees need a higher level, and it's also worth considering, I suppose, what format those management accounts are provided in. Some people prefer kind of diagrammatical representations of information. Some people prefer narrative. Again, it's important just that that the board has a clear understanding, because ultimately they are all responsible for that financial information and for the position of the charity as well. Again, it may be worth including some key performance indicators just to get almost a clear picture in kind of a small amount of information as possible to identify any areas where they are key and kind of vital to the performance of the charity. And again, it's important that the board acknowledges their responsibility and engages with the finances at the same level as other information as well. So again, that board engagement should be emphasised in trustee as part of trustee recruitment and induction, with a kind of an explanation of the strategy and also the budgets and how those have been set, just so that the board has a clear understanding of where that information has come from. Again, it could be built into a trustee contract so that the trustee is acknowledging their responsibility, and used as part of the skills audit, so to just check what level of understanding trustees have around the finances, and if that needs, I suppose, additional skills, look at trustee training around those finance areas as well. Okay, so just going on to look a little bit at the governance code. So just in terms of a bit of background, the governance code was issued originally in 2017 and was, I suppose, intended as a framework for, I suppose, establishing good governance in charities. It was a collaboration between a number of voluntary organisations, and there are separate codes for small and large charities as well. Originally, there are 7 principles. So each principle sets out the rationale of why it's important, the key outcomes that arise from implementing that, and also the areas of recommended practice that result from that as well. So they've recently updated the code. It was a kind of a refresh of the code rather than a full revision, to ensure that there's a kind of a balance between updating the code and allowing people who were working towards it to continue along the same path with kind of the same ultimate goals. So what they've actually done is it's refreshed the integrity principle, they've changed that, and the diversity principle has been revised, so it's now the equality, diversity and inclusion principle. So in terms of the integrity principle, the focus has shifted. So previously it was around maintaining the charity reputation and also managing conflicts of interest. It's now much more wide-reaching, and it's more focused on ensuring there's a culture within the charity that will help achieve the charity's purpose. Again, the trustee code of conduct should reinforce the values, and it's more around creating that culture of ethics and values around everything that the charity does. And again, it emphasises the creation of a safe and supportive environment, ensuring there's references to safeguarding policies and procedures, and it also includes the recommendation that staff should be aware of who to report concerns to. And then in terms of the equality, diversity and inclusion, again, this acknowledges that this is a journey for charities. It's not something that will be resolved immediately. And so the charity should consider why equality and diversity is important for that charity. Look at where they are currently in terms of diversity and inclusion, and assess, I suppose, where they would like to be. So that, again, looking at the context of the charity, it's what would diversity mean for that individual charity, because that will vary. And then setting targets that are realistic for that charity, I suppose in the medium term. And then looking, once I suppose some of that has been implemented and monitored and reported on going forward, I think it recommends also sharing lessons with other charities and kind of areas of best practice and where the challenges have been. Again, just to help and assist in other charities on that journey as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to James.
Oh, thank you, Nicola. That's brilliant. Right. Okay, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what you might want to do if you're in a situation where you feel you want to improve your governance structures, or indeed if you're in a situation where you sort of maybe want to review them to see if they're fit for purpose. So I'm going to sort of do a very brief summary of some of the things you might want to sort of think about if you're trying to adopt good governance at your charity. Okay, so my first tip on adopting good governance is simply just getting it onto the agenda. Now, there are several ways this can be approached, but I think a good starting point is just simply having it as an agenda item at board level. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that all of the work around good governance should be done at board. In fact, later on, I'll explain a little about how adopting good governance will often require tasks to be cascaded down into working groups. That said, I think an initial and periodic airing at board meetings helps add focus, and it also keeps it in the forefront of people's minds. In my experience as sort of, attending trustee meetings as an auditor and being a trustee myself, is very often there's a fair amount of governance expertise around the board. So very often you'll have that discussion and there will be already an immediate awareness of what the strengths and weaknesses might be within the existing structure. And an initial discussion will probably flush out some areas that need immediate attention. That said, if you're not sure where to start, or if you need to understand a little bit more about what you don't know, there are a number of ways of systematically reviewing your organization's governance. So one approach might be simply to commission a governance review. So a governance review is like a mini audit. It's administered by a governance expert, and the scope can be agreed in advance. And having a governance expert look at your affairs will, without a doubt, bring new insights into potential areas of improvement. And MHA can certainly help with that exercise if that's something that you're interested in pursuing. Another approach is to try and use one of the frameworks available. And so Nicola, I think, so very helpfully described a little bit about the governance code. And I think Fiona will probably be talking a little bit about this as well. And the governance code is brilliant. It's got a really, really easy to access website, and it breaks down the charity governance into 7 broad categories, which is organizational purpose, leadership, integrity, decision-making, risk control, board effectiveness, equality, diversity, inclusion, and openness and accountability. So, those 7 areas have got really sort of easy to follow guidance on the website. They talk about key principles, and they also interestingly split the guidance down. So there's separate guidance for larger charities compared to smaller ones. Another really good tool, although primarily aimed at the academy sector, is the National Governance Association's 21 questions, which they sort of suggest academy trustees should be asking themselves annually. So again, the areas covered in these questions are actually very similar to the governance code. It's things like vision, ethos and strategy, governance structures, board effectiveness, engagement, accountability, leadership and impact. So I do think that this structured approach works well, and whatever the approach of your framework adopted, I think the idea here is to systematically consider areas of good governance and hold yourself accountable. Now, having done a number of governance reviews over the years myself, I think it is notable that there can be a sense of anxiety sometimes about looking under the hood in this way. I think in particular, trustees sometimes feel a little bit concerned that they are being scrutinised. But whenever we've done these governance reviews, I think it's always subsequently been considered a really valuable exercise. So I think, you know, if possible, you need to sort of encourage your fellow trustees to sort of put their anxieties to one side. Okay, so the next sort of area I think is worth sort of thinking about is the charity's governing documents or its constitution. So, you know, I think be honest with yourselves. I mean, when is the last time you at your charity have collectively read this document? Indeed, can you say that you've read this document in full? I suspect there'll be many trustees who won't be able to profess that. So the governing document is really key, and it does act as a charity's rule book, and it details the obligations of trustees, and where appropriate, also the powers and obligations of the members. It will set boundaries on what trustees or members have the powers to do. And this is particularly important because the trustee has a personal duty to ensure that the charity is acting within its powers. So to illustrate what I mean by this, imagine a situation where a charity makes a decision to invest some of its excess reserves on the stock market. So, I mean, this in itself is not uncommon, but let's also assume that something goes horribly wrong, the market crashes, and a lot of that money is lost. Now, normally, provided the trustees can demonstrate they've acted with due care, then normally this situation doesn't reverberate back to the trustees personally. However, if the governing document expressly prohibited such investments, then actually the trustees in that situation would be deemed to have been in breach of trust. And in that scenario, they could actually be personally liable for the losses. So it is really important to understand what the parameters are. I think part of the problem here is that the charities document tends to gather dust. It gets forgotten about. You may look at it, when you set up the charity, it gets put in a drawer and then people don't look at it again for many years. Combine that with mission drift. So, charities sometimes inadvertently find themselves doing something slightly different to when they first started. And, that combined can be a real recipe for disaster. So I think it is really useful to review your governing documents. The document will have things like the objects of the charity, so what charitable purposes the charity is allowed to act in. It will talk about the powers that the trustees have. It will also talk about how trustees are appointed and potentially removed. Often there's guidance about how you administer meetings and what voting rights are. And where you do have a membership, it will also talk about how that's administered as well. There will be financial frameworks within the Constitution as well. So going back to my example, it will sort of tell you what powers you have to invest funds, for instance. Furthermore, there's often text in there about how you handle trustee benefits. So can trustees be paid? And ultimately, it also dictates how you might dissolve the charity should you decide to do so. So if you're in a position where your constitution is very old, it would probably be helpful to have a specialist solicitor look over them for you, and your local MHA representative undoubtedly can put you in contact with a suitably qualified individual if that's needed. Okay, so business strategy is the next area which I think needs to be thought about. And if you've got a very small charity, I think it can be difficult to find the time to set strategy. But obviously having a clear idea of purpose and direction is at the core of good governance. Business strategies normally cover a period of 3 to 5 years and will aim to match the charity's capabilities with the needs of stakeholders. It acts as a guide to prioritise objectives and maximise charitable outputs. In my experience, the strategy is almost certainly set by the CEO or senior management team with trustee input and support. But in setting the strategy, there does need to be time to reflect on the wider organisation. Often this involves looking closely at the needs of beneficiaries and even including them in the process. Sometimes a simple SWOT analysis, so that's breaking down the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, can be a really good place to start. These tools are really useful and they often allow organisations to start structuring priorities around the organisation. Another thing to consider is trying to link the strategy to outcome. This allows organisations to demonstrate achievements and failures and to understand their impact. Not only is this becoming more and more important within the context of fundraising, and what I mean by that is that lots of grant funders are now sort of really interested to see charities that can demonstrate impact, but it does also increase accountability. So one charity I work closely with has got a suite of KPIs which measure outcome in a variety of ways. All of these outcomes have a budgeted growth target over the next 5 years, and the charity is always checking its progress against that trajectory. What I think is really interesting about this charity as well is that there is, there's monthly internal discussions with the senior management team, and often delegated discussions and decisions are framed within the context of these KPIs. So it's an example of a charity where that strategy has really then been embedded well and truly into the organisational structure. And I would argue charities that do that have a much lower chance of drifting in terms of their mission than organisations that don't. Very much like that constitution, though, there is a risk that when the strategies are set, they end up sitting at a desk and gathering dust. And I would argue that the role of trustees is to help keep that strategy alive and winning the hearts and minds of the wider organisation. This often revolves around ways the strategy can be communicated. I mean, I really like the idea of overarching strategy statements, but having a planned and delivered communications policy more broadly, I think, is important, as well as integrating the strategy into performance management and other approaches. Okay, so setting a business plan helps bring the what and when into focus. Now, engaging with values helps shape the how and the why. So many charities will set a business plan, but many actually ignore doing the work on values. Often people sometimes think of them as being a little wishy-washy, and in that regard, I am sympathetic. I'm an accountant. I have a propensity to focus heavily on hard facts and numbers and KPIs, but actually, there is an importance in trying to understand the underlying culture or way of working. So I sat in a trustees meeting recently where values were discussed, and the trustees all believed that the organisational culture was positive, but none of them could necessarily articulate them. Now, articulating ideas brings them into consciousness, and recording them sets them for future generations. Often organisational cultures are driven by the leaders, and changes in key staff can create sudden changes in the culture. But if you have a culture you'd like, articulate it, record it, and it will lower the risk of those cultural changes occurring in the future. Another important consideration is ensuring that the values once set are limiting ideas and not useful to periodically ask the question as to whether the relevant stakeholders understand the values and to try to understand the extent that they are driving behaviours. If you have not set organisational values before, it's potentially a large exercise. And my top tips would be: one, firstly, consult widely. Include at least some of your beneficiaries and other stakeholders. If you rely on volunteers, I think it's really important they're involved with the process too. So that would be my second point. If you do rely on volunteers, get them involved. They are very often the eyes and ears of your organisation, and bringing them into the values process, that they will bring a lot of useful material. I'd argue that it's important to keep language simple affirmative and action-based. Verbs are much better than nouns. For instance, instead of saying our values are honesty, it's better to say we will always tell the truth. The latter suggests action. And then keep the commitments fresh by regular discussions about them at meetings. So I've picked up a few areas that you may want to start looking at if you're sort of undertaking a process to look at your governance. And you may be thinking, well, there's a fair amount of work involved here, and you would be right. Now, board meetings are often the only chance an organisation has is to get all of those key decision makers into one room. And so often the priority is to make the key decisions needed to enable the workflow of the charity to continue. So if you create a series of working groups with the mandate of looking at some of these issues, the board can use that really important face-to-face time to monitor the charity's progress against its strategy or to make those key decisions. I have seen structures where there's actually a specific governance subcommittee that reports to the board, and this can have a schedule of work where issues like the governing document, values, business plan are all considered on a regular cyclical basis. Now, there isn't a necessity for all members of these working groups to be trustees, but if it is the case that other experts are brought in, it is important that the delegated authorities have been fully considered and the issues requiring board decision and ratification are correctly tabled. Indeed, actually, I think it's really useful to bring in experts to help support these committees. Often charities will invite friendly individuals who have an expertise, but maybe not the time to commit to board. Conversely, using volunteers in this way can be as a mechanism to test potential trustees, seeing how they cope within a working group before full invitation to the board. Working groups can be transient, matching the ever-changing needs of the organisation. During the COVID lockdowns, I saw a number of effective boards quickly react with effective working groups looking at the key issues. So any organisation to effectively adopt good governance structures, I think there has to be that ability to delegate work from the main board and to be flexible and adapt structures when needs arise. So I think Fiona will be talking a little bit more about the broader approach to reviewing board effectiveness and ensuring there are adequate skills on the board. However, one aspect I wanted to draw out is the perennial question as to whether user representation is helpful. This approach isn't getting increasing popularity, but clearly also brings its own challenges and its own risks. So I do think it's an important one to consider, but I think you do have to weigh up all of the benefits and risks when making a decision. That said, I think it's something that should be asked regularly. Organisations are often very concerned about how they keep their staff or volunteers engaged, but this often gets overlooked when it comes to the Board of Trustees. Does your charity have a communication strategy with this stakeholder group? One charity I'm aware of starts each board meeting with a story from an individual within the organisation describing a user experience. Board members become detached from the work on the ground, and I think this sort of communication helps keep trustees aware of the priorities as well as motivating this important volunteer group. Trustee away days are often touted as a really important tool to keep trustees motivated and focused, but I argue sort of greater visibility of the user experience can be just as effective. More broadly, questions of whether trustee appraisals are a useful tool are often met with a degree of scepticism. To some, it seems churlish to hold trustees accountable in their performance, given they donate large amounts of their time at no cost. However, handling appropriately, this can be a useful opportunity for trustees to air their concerns on a one-to-one basis, which may otherwise be difficult. Similarly, it's an opportunity to thank the trustees for their hard work. Clearly, the chair is the best person to deliver this kind of one-to-one support, which segues quite nicely to my next slide. Throughout all of this, the chair will need to have a strong grasp on what good governance looks like and be prepared to drive this forward. Chair effectiveness is a key driver for good governance, and it's interesting that the 21 questions Academy Trust should be asking themselves, which I mentioned earlier, no less than 3 questions revolve around chair effectiveness. I think that to some extent, effective chairs are born and not made, and what I mean by this is that personality is really important. Chairs who are too absorbed in having their own voice heard will not be effective, and the roles require empathy and tact, which cannot always be learnt. The role also requires a significant time commitment to be run effectively. I often note that retired individuals end up being very effective chairs as they have the capacity for the various online discussions and meetings. I advocate the use of regular 360 feedback on chair performance. This can be relatively low level, such as getting feedback at the end of a meeting on how the participants felt things went, to a more formal chance for trustees and management to raise concerns. And there are a number of online tools that allow for confidential 360 feedback to be given and collated. But whatever your approach, however, the chair is a pivotal role within the governance structure, and it does need careful recruitment and monitoring. My final point here is that adopting good governance is never one piece of discrete work. It's like painting the fourth bridge. When you get to the end, you have to start all over again. So I'm a great advocate of having a separate governance committee, which is continually reviewing the governance issues. I think without this, governance can easily slip off the radar. Don't be afraid to bring in expert advice if appropriate. A governance review provides a fresh pair of eyes, and the benefits of working with someone who would have seen similar organisations can be really valuable. Where we've been asked to provide internal audit services, I often suggest a governance review is a great place to start the ball rolling. The approach to governance filters through to all parts of an organisation, and its continual development is a strong factor in overall success. So that's my top tips. I'll now hand over to Fiona. Hi, Fiona, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, James. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. So whilst I am a partner at MHA, and as Sudhir said before, mainly focus on sort of audits and support of charities, I'm also a trustee of a number of organisations, have been over the years, and thought it would be helpful to bring a trustee's perspective on good governance. So what I've done, therefore, and plan to do is to think about how in those organisations we've used the code effectively as a tool as to how we operate our charities in the aspect of governance. So sorts of charities I've been involved with. So at the moment, I'm the Finance and Performance Committee Chair at Sustrans, a national walking and cycling charity, but I'm also Chair of Governors at a local primary school. The code applies, as James has said, to all sizes of charity, and there are some really helpful notes and guidance areas for depending on the size of charity that you have. So at Sustrans, we've undertaken quite a detailed examination of our compliance with the code, whereas actually at smaller organisations we've just used it perhaps as an aid memoir, an area to think about. And to be honest, quite a lot of what's in the code is actually quite instinctive sort of anyway for those of us who are quite experienced as trustees. When have we decided to use the code specifically, refer to it in times of change? So in a few years ago, we had quite a big change in the board members, and we specifically decided to use the tool to provide a framework for the board and how we would operate both as a board, but then also overseeing the charity and working with the executive team on an ongoing basis. Also, we've used it just for ongoing compliance, particular areas that we've thought about looking at. It's really helpful as a sense check to think about, are we complying? Are there some areas we could look at thinking about and improving? The code deliberately talks about being aspirational in nature, and it is the intention that it's used for continuous improvement rather than here's the code, do we comply, do we not, how do we comply, and then sort of effectively put it on the shelf and move forward. Continual review is the best area. As James has already referred to, you can get an external governance review. That's helpful to get some oversight and some external view, but actually it's quite easy to do an internal review as well. And in fact, we as MHA have a checklist, a code of governance questionnaire, which is really quite easy to follow and is a great starting point for areas for perhaps that deserve a deeper dive. So in terms of organise, so I'll go through the 7 principles now. The first being organisational purpose. So we spent some designated time at a board thinking about and getting clarity on the mission and purpose of the charity. So at Sustrans, our vision is a society where the way we travel creates healthier places and happier lives for everyone. And our mission is to make it easier for people to walk and cycle. You wouldn't believe the amount of time that we spent focusing on what does everyone mean to each of us. And that was really important and really valuable time invested, actually, which helped all of us at board level vocalise and know what we mean by those, those words and strap lines. But then it helps us lead then the organisation going forward. So we were able to demonstrate leadership throughout the organisation. Once we had it very clear in our minds what all of that meant, we could articulate the words and what we were doing and why consistently to funders, to other supporters, to colleagues and all sorts of stakeholders involved with the charity. It was a really good basis for how we conduct ourselves and make decisions on going forward. So an example of that to draw on in the last year would be, walking and cycling became very high profile with the government's COVID exercise, 20 minutes a day that we were allowed to leave the house for during lockdown. And so unlike some charities, money became available to support our particular purpose. But what we wanted to do and we were able to do, having had that thoughts and discussions and were able to articulate what we did, was really think about what money we wanted to take to help us fulfill our purpose, but also helped us be robust in what we took money for, and that's not easy when people are trying to give you money that actually you take the time to consider, will this fulfill our purpose and our mission. Didn't mean we didn't think about different things. COVID was new to all of us, lots of opportunities in the case of Sustrans in particular, but also in the school that I work in. We were given funding for various things, particularly for children who had less access to the IT we're all using now. So again, thinking particularly about what's the best basis of using it. If you've got that organisational purpose clear behind you, it does become easier to be a bit more agile in some of those decision making processes. In the charities I've worked with over the years, there, in many of them, there has been a risk of scope creep, and sometimes even I've seen charities starting to do things because the money's available. Actually, they start doing things that actually isn't even in line with their original objectives. So that clarity helps all of those things. Thinking about leadership then, the trustee recruitment and interview process, it's really helpful to have think about what you need in terms of skills. Diversity is something in particular we're looking at in one of the organisations I've been involved with. Diversity at board level. It's all well and good having a policy, but how do we actually bring that policy to life? And in terms of recruitment, where are we advertising? Who are we trying to gain access to? And it's really important then to think about that in terms of the leadership from the top often then shapes the organisation. We've got a trustee manual in all the organisations I'm involved with at the moment, setting out, the roles and responsibilities. There's a trustee role, and that's given to new trustees as part of the recruitment, in fact, and also then induction process. Terms of reference of subcommittees, don't just prepare them and stick them on the shelf. Make sure they're clear, make sure they're fit for purpose, and they suit your current environment and what you're moving towards. As an example, we have an audit and risk committee and a finance and performance committee. What we identified was that there was a bit of sort of crossover, risk of crossover on the clarity of finance risk. So we had the risk of no one looking at it, or both committees kind of looking at it. And so we've spent a bit of time just tweaking whose responsibility that particular area of risk is, and what information is needed around that. We've also, in terms of decision making, we've also recently updated in one of the organisations that I'm involved with, the recording of minutes. It's often seen as a sort of a must-have task, but actually we found it really helpful to have a proper decisions and particularly actions log that we then revisit. It's clear to the executive team what is needed, the ownership of those actions and the time frame around them, and we then make sure from a governance perspective we revisit those at the next meeting. With Nicola and James have talked a bit about time commitment. It's really important that there's a lot of time commitment, and James particularly talked about the chair's commitment, but it's really important that there is clarity around that right from the recruitment stage, and don't be afraid to revisit people's level of time that they can commit. The world changes. Some of us have new jobs, other commitments, personal commitments, and those sorts of things. And so don't be afraid to re-look at board level. Who's able to commit what, whether you can look at committee membership, or indeed whether it really works for an individual to continue to be a trustee. So in terms of integrity, then it's really important to have clarity and agreement of the values to help the organisation live and promote them. So we've asked ourselves how what we do will be seen by our colleagues and supporters. Something particular, so at Sustrans we receive quite a lot of grants, and it's really important to not just go, lovely, some money, I've talked about earlier, lovely money to do what we want to do, but also to think about where's it coming from, what will it, what's the vision, what will it look like for others in terms of accepting and delivering on those grants. It's really important that you have clear policies as well. Some things just really from a simple integrity point of view, but also from a legal point of view, it really just cannot be delegated to subcommittees. You might get subcommittees to do some of the scrutiny around processes and controls, but for example safeguarding health and safety in a school, and most organisations that interact with the public, that's absolutely fundamental, and it's really important that it isn't just given sort of lip service, and it's really from integrity point of view considered with due purpose. It's and even simple things in terms of the lens that people will see the trustee board through. It's good practice to record potential conflicts, always have it at the start of the agenda, but also be honest about those conflicts. We've recently considered receiving a grant and doing some work on the National Cycle Network that actually impacted on the paths of another organisation that one of our fellow trustees is involved as an executive on, and so he very clearly vocalised that involvement, and we had a clear discussion about what we thought was appropriate in terms of dealing with that conflict. In that particular instance, he did step out of the room. Don't be afraid to do that. It's really important that some of those simple things are dealt with appropriately and seen to be dealt with appropriately. In terms of decision making, do you have a delegation framework? Is it complied with, or is it a nice document that sort of gathers dust? It needs to be reviewed and updated to confirm it's fit for purpose. It's not normally referred to on a daily basis, but of all the times in the last sort of 18 or so months, looking at whether that's it's fit for purpose when we all had to change to moving from working from home and to having a different control environment. That was really important, but also on a day-to-day basis, for example, making sure things like bank signatories are up to date for changes in staffing or approval thresholds. Are they right in terms of just the ongoing operation of the charity? Is the threshold so high that the board never appear to approve anything, or is it so low that it comes all the time and it actually just stops the executive team from operating effectively? So Nicola talked a bit about management information. To share with you, our reporting has evolved significantly in the last few years. We've really thought about what information we need to be able to make the decisions. Talking about grants again, sorry, but we found that actually when they came for approval, quite often the trustees were asking supplementary questions, which meant that the executive team sort of had to go away, gather some information and come back again. And actually, so what we've done is really finesse what that information, what those common questions are, so that we can make that approval process much more efficient. We start the year with what I would call a blue sky funding gap as well. So that's funding that we don't know where it's going to come from. And so actually what we've decided is that's really important that we understand the risk around that, not just a sort of a pipeline, but we've really developed our risk reporting in that particular area. And then there's some sort of basic things in terms of decision making and controls. Have a board and subcommittee programme. Make sure that there's a sort of calendar where you can review the policies regularly, and make sure that there's time to consider some of those key things like board effectiveness. Speaking of which, then, over the last couple of years, we've really focused on this, very focused on the skills needed and how that actually changes over time, and needing to keep up to date on that. So we do a skills audit every year, and particularly in advance of trustee recruitment, really trying to understand what those skills need, and not be afraid, if you're able to, on some of your subcommittee, to perhaps bolster those subcommittees with particular skills that are outside of the trustee board. Rotation, that's very clear in some governing documents, but consider what's ideal and practical. We found that the chairs, and the chair of the charity and the chair of a couple of the subcommittees were all on the same rotation cycle, and actually, so what we've done is actually we've shortened and lengthened some, effectively, so that we don't all rotate off the board at the same time and lose some of that knowledge within the charity. Inductions, really important. Is your induction process fit for purpose? You take feedback from new trustees. How did it feel for them? What would they have liked to know? And ongoing training is important, not only for new trustees, but to make sure that existing trustees are able to fulfil their role effectively, particularly if they have a new role within the charity. Equality and diversity, I've talked a bit about this in terms of our recruitment. It is a big focus for us, not only to have it as an important value for us, but actually the how do we recruit different people to the board. People look up at the board, and it's important that the rest of the organisation can see that the board is living and breathing those values as well. Openness and accountability, then it's really important that the charity's able to deliver its aims and be clear, and the board can demonstrate that openness and accountability. So be clear. We have found, James mentioned bringing people to the board to give examples of what the charity does, but we've also found we do that, and we found it's great in terms of actually helping them cascade how the board works, and how it's working effectively or otherwise. And in fact, we sometimes have guest speakers from outside of the organisation, from some of our key stakeholders. Again, they see in real life, how we're operating and how we are, being open, and the level of accountability that we have. Don't be afraid also to, you have to deal with things, hopefully not too often, but complaints, and giving some real clarity around that process, and that due consideration has been given for those things. Same in terms of the important area of the moment of executive remuneration. Make sure that is clear and transparent, and due time is given to those sorts of things. So that comes to the end of my section. So I'll hand back to Sudhir.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and really appreciate your presentation, but everyone's presentations, which has been really fantastic. I found it really helpful, not only to identify some of the guidance and the theory behind good governance, but I think we've had lots of really good practical tips about how we actually implement good governance in our charities. And I do think that's so important. I remember there was a Charity Commission guide a number of years ago. It was called The Hallmarks of a Successful Charity. And it was the Charity Commission's view as to essentially what was good governance. Actually, they abandoned that publication when the governance code got issued. They decided that was all that was needed. They didn't need to do their own guidance. But I think it emphasised what we all know, but the Charity Commission also know, is that good governance is so important to the effectiveness and the success of all our charities. And I really think that highlights what I think is one of the big risks in the charity sector, which is about mediocrity. It's not just trying to address poor governance, but actually just governance that ought to be better. And Fiona, you'll know this as your chair of governors thing. I quite like Ofsted in terms of one probably best not say too much about what I like or not like Ofsted, but one thing I think is good is their gradings. There used to be a grading that they had. It was outstanding good, then it used to be satisfactory. That was the third level down. And they changed that. They're no longer using the term satisfactory. They say it requires improvement. And I think that's absolutely the right attitude. It's even better if is the question. How do we keep moving forward? And I think that's been a strong message from all our presenters, and I'm really delighted that's been the case. And really delighted also because in MHA, we're really strongly committed to doing all we can to encourage that really strong and outstanding charity governance. And for that reason, a couple of years ago, we created this portal, which we call our Charity Trustee Hub, the MHA Trustee Hub. And it's basically a way of us sharing lots of guidance and practical resources to help charities adopt that excellent governance that I'm talking about. So here on the next couple of slides, you'll see a little bit of detail about some of the resources that are on there on governance. There are other resources as well, but this is just a little bit of a sample of some of those things. So there are things like webinars, and I'd maybe highlight particularly at the moment a webinar we did earlier this year on going concern and financial sustainability, something that a lot of charities are thinking about. And so there's a practical webinar available on demand on that. There are various guides that are available as well. I can move my cursor down. There are checklists of various natures that you can use as a practical tool, and various policy documents and help sheets as well. So that's all available to you should you wish to access them. So we now have a chance to address some questions. Whilst you think about questions, please do use the Q&A function. There's a button that should be at the bottom of your screens, and if you use that, the questions will come through to me. Just wanted to ask one or two questions to begin with, and one or two observations. So first of all, Fiona, you talked about how governance has been affected over the COVID period, and I guess it'd be just interesting, you, James, and Nicola, if there are things that you've seen people doing that are lessons for the future for how we do good governance. Anything that we can take away, taking the positives, if you like, out of the coronavirus experience.
Well, I suppose one thing I've noticed is that IT and digital has certainly gone up on people's agendas. So I think, if your IT strategy was behind, or your IT infrastructure wasn't fit for purpose, it really showed during COVID. And actually, a lot of delivery is now happening online. Like, for instance, this presentation today, maybe, a few years ago, we would have all met in a big room. So, I mean, what I'm starting to notice is actually some boards starting to recognise that and to get IT experts onto the board and to make sure that the governance around IT and the strategy around IT is fit for purpose.
That's really helpful, James.
I think it's kind of brought into the forefront more of the discussions around what we want to do going forward. I think because I suppose during COVID we kind of were a lot more involved in making kind of, I suppose, faster decisions around various changes in services and how that impacts people. And I think, again, rather than, I suppose, going back to what we did before and just kind of almost not being, I suppose, as engaged potentially or as conscious of those changes, I think it is much more awareness now of actually what we can do and what we can and what we need to look at going forward. So I think everybody's just got more involved. From, I suppose, we went from kind of having 3 meetings a year to having kind of almost a meeting every other week. So I think it did just bring to light, really, again, the opportunities.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Nicola. Fiona, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
I think just to follow on from Nicola, what the time now is probably we move very quickly to making sort of hand to mouth almost decisions, but actually now's the time to move to thinking more strategically into the future and being supporting how the charity will be sustainable going forward.
that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think that there will be sort of more discussions at sort of trustee level about reserve policy. I mean, I think anecdotally, auditing lots of charities, we see lots of them survive quite well, but that was not without the generosity of central government. And we don't know what the long-term world will look like, whether there'll be new variants and lockdowns in the future, and whether that support will be as generous in the future. So certainly, I think, the questions, the pressure to kind of use up reserves maybe will be slightly less, and there'll be more emphasis on saying, well, actually, maybe we need a bit more in case there are other problems again in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen in the past, haven't we, James, that the charity sector sometimes lags the commercial sector in terms of the impact of these sort of events. And just as the public might think everything's getting back onto an even keel for the charity sector, that's when it becomes particularly hard for some. So I agree. So I would emphasise the webinar I mentioned earlier about going concern and sustainability. There's hopefully some useful tips there. Now, looking at questions, we've got a question from Alan Johnson that I'm not sure I completely understand. His question was, what about a business plan? I'm not sure exactly what that was meaning, but maybe it means that to what extent do we think business plans are important to have in charities? I think that might potentially, James, have come up during your presentation, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in my presentation, I talked about business strategy, Alan, and I would say the business plan and the business strategy are interchangeable, and people use the words interchangeably. So I think you are looking at the same thing here, a 3 to 5 year outlook on terms of finance, and a really sort of clear idea of what your key objectives are in terms of charitable output. So you're sort of matching your resources to maximize your output. So I completely agree. I think it is critical. As I said, I think sort of most sort of larger charities would automatically have it. I think it's the smaller charities who probably do sometimes overlook giving it the time and effort it really needs.
Thank you, James. And I would just add that I'm certainly seeing people moving. Lots of charities just have annual budgets, and now we're seeing very much a need to look a bit further into the future. So not only the business plans, but the budgets and forecasts being multi-year rolling budgets. That sort of approach is increasingly what we see on the financial governance side. We have a question about from Tim Moss saying, trustees are keen to appraise the executives, but less keen to be appraised themselves. What is a good approach for the executive to recommend to the board that the trustees are appraised? Fiona, do you want to talk a little bit about that in practice? Having you were talking about appraisal yourself and how you get your fellow trustees to get on board with that.
So it's a standing sort of item. I talked about having a plan for the subcommittees and the board. It's actually a standard item in that calendar that we do kind of once a year. It's helpful to get the trustee chair sort of on board as to it is good governance. Wherever you read about good governance, it always refers to board and trustee effectiveness. So in terms of the executives kind of weigh in, have that discussion with the board, but particularly the chair to lead by example. And then there are some great and easy questionnaires that can be sent round, and then it's about normally I would expect the executive team to help look at the feedback from those questionnaires, but just get it on the calendar, and maybe you do it as part of generating that calendar for the committees and the board, as I say.
I think there's also it is quite an awkward thing to sort of raise, isn't it? I think sometimes people feel a little bit difficult about suggesting trustee appraisals, because these are people who are volunteering their time for free, and although it's good governance, I think there's sometimes a reticence to engage with it. And actually, I think that's where governance reviews are really helpful. So having a third party, a neutral party, come in and say, well, actually, these things are really important, you should be doing it. It sort of takes some of that sort of awkwardness out of the discussion if you're trying to introduce it.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Fiona. I'm going to try and link a couple of the questions that we've had from George Jenkins and from Louise Jackson. George was saying that the charities that have been able to increase reserves over the pandemic period, how have you seen this working across the charities you deal with in terms of justifying the need for new donations and adequately explaining why reserves have increased? Are there some good examples of how this has been well managed? And yes, I've certainly seen that as a pandemic bonus, if you like. We've had funds coming out of the woodwork quite significantly for some charities, and so that is a situation we've seen elsewhere. But can I leave that to a question from Louise Jackson, which she says, James mentioned budgeted growth targets as part of KPIs. Could you give an expansion on this and give practical examples, perhaps? So it's really, I suppose, in both cases, both Louise and George are thinking about future fundraising and reserves, those sorts of issues. Do we have any observations about those areas?
So you asked me to sort of flesh out sort of growth targets. So without sort of going into the minutiae detail, I suppose there's one charity that I've worked with, which without a doubt wants to expand the number of people it's number of users it's reaching. So that was one of the KPIs it's set. So currently it may be reaching 3% of the people in the county, and by 5 years' time it wants to reach 15%, for instance. And so what they sort of produce are these lovely graphs where you see the trajectory you need to achieve if you're going to get to that endpoint in a few years' time, and you can see where you're sitting on that trajectory. So hopefully that sort of illustrates the kind of thing that is useful to do. I suppose it's having a KPI, but also having a budget in the background to show how that's going to move forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
In terms of sort of growing reserves, then the key thing is about communication and being quite transparent, about that. Reserves levels go up and down for various reasons, whether you've got funding in advance for a future project, or you've been given some funds as the government was providing funds, and why wouldn't you take the opportunity to draw on some of those funds? And so actually it's about transparency as to why you've got those funds. If you're sort of concerned, if that's an appropriate word, about the level of funds you've got, be really clear why you've got them and what you're going to do with them in the future, whether it's straightforward spending it, or whether it's investing in the charity's future. IT is a classic area we've talked about. Most charities are needing to invest quite heavily in IT. They might have done on a sort of patchwork basis in the last 18 months, but they might need some quite significant investment sort of going forward. And so I think if the trustees are clear and the executive are clear, then that will help everyone else vocalise why you've got funds at the moment.
I mean, you can also reflect some of those funds as designated to make it clear that they are almost going to be used for a particular purpose, and that is why you are keeping them. And if you link that, I suppose if you're looking at it in terms of an annual accounts basis, if you link that back with the kind of the reserves explanation in the trustees report, your reserves policy, and kind of give that, as you said, that clear, transparent narrative of what's going on, I think then that will make it, I suppose, more evident to I suppose funders and other stakeholders what's going on.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Fiona. And so I suppose in summary, that's about accountability and transparency, which are all good principles to have, and quite nice in the charity sector to not be resource constrained for once, and because typically beneficiaries' needs tend to be there, and we struggle to extinguish those needs at the moment, and particularly as we come out of the pandemic, I think we're seeing across the sector in the expectation of increased need. I'm going to now wrap up, since we've actually overrun by a couple of minutes, but I was keen that we try to answer all the questions that we've been getting. There's, I think, maybe a couple of little questions that we haven't been able to answer. We'll seek to do that offline, as I said earlier. I want to thank our speakers, to Nicola, Fiona and James, and also our back office team at MHA for all that they did to put this together. I want to thank you as participants for all your attention and on your really good questions. And just to mention that we do have regular webinars. We have another webinar scheduled on the 9th of November. So 9th of November, and that's going to be focused on financial reporting in the charity sector, looking at UK and international financial reporting, but also some developments in narrative reporting, so impact reporting and sustainability. So we'll be allowing bookings for those that webinar very soon. Look out for the details, and I hope you'll be able to join us then. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention this morning. Bye.